Ready?
Go.
We are a part of the WREOA, which is the Women's Rights Equal Opportunity Advocacy. This is a group that advocates for women's rights in our world today.
Go. We want you to join our movement because women's rights are human rights.
In this video, we are going to be focusing on specific case studies on women's rights.
Each of us has an individual case study that we are focusing on. Maggie's case is reproductive rights, mine is domestic violence, Micah's is domestic workers' rights and equality, and Catherine's is gender equality in sports.
The larger issue we are focusing on is women's rights. There are many current and long-standing injustices that women face, specifically reproductive rights. This means having the right to decide if and how you want to become pregnant or reproduce. This has been a persistent issue in the U.S. for decades. In 2022, there was a leaked Supreme Court draft stating that the members of the Supreme Court want to overturn the decision of Roe v. Wade case from 1973. This decision gave women the right to choose to terminate a pregnancy / have an abortion. This issue directly connects back to the second wave of feminism. Second wave feminism focuses on many modern-day issues, but a big one was reproductive rights. There were protests, organizations, and court cases that were dedicated to getting women easy access to make choices for their bodies. Roe v. Wade was a huge part of this movement, and to lose it would be to lose everything women have fought for the last 100 years. In the U.S., there are millions of women who face poverty or other conditions that make them unable to raise a child. These laws and rights protect their right to choose when it is best for them to become a parent. If Roe v. Wade is overturned, women will not have access to abortion after about 6 weeks of pregnancy. This may not seem like a big deal, but in reality, most women do not find out they are pregnant until after 6 weeks. If a woman is not mentally, physically, and/or financially prepared and capable of raising a child or carrying a child, she should not be forced to.
One challenge that women face today is domestic violence. The majority of domestic violence victims are women, as almost 30% of women experience physical or sexual violence in their relationship, but domestic violence can affect everyone and anyone can be a victim of it. Today's fight against domestic violence strongly relates to the second wave of feminism. During the second wave of feminism, people came together to fight for social equality, and a major part of that fighting was advocating for domestic violence. Women created shelters for victims of domestic violence and spread awareness about the issue. A connection between today's fight against domestic violence and historical events is in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act, or the VAWA, was passed, which acknowledged domestic violence against women as a crime. Although the VAWA Act was passed, and for decades people have been fighting against domestic violence, it is still very prevalent in our society. According to the National Statistics Domestic Violence Fact Sheet, on average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. Even though there are laws protecting against domestic violence, it is still something that should not be ignored, as it affects millions of people per year and it is an ongoing problem in the United States and around the world. Fighting against domestic violence is incredibly important because it affects thousands of people each day. It can severely affect a person's life and cause severe physical, emotional damage and trauma to a person. No one should have to experience domestic violence, and everyone who does needs to know they are supported and have access to help.
I chose to focus on domestic workers' rights. Domestic workers are anyone who is paid to work in someone's house. This includes nannies, cleaners, people that care for the elderly, and much more. Being a domestic worker is a career that is heavily dominated by women. 91.5% of domestic workers are women, so this is a women's rights issue. Women serve an important job in our society by helping support families and households through domestic jobs. Yet, these workers are often underpaid, exploited, and at high risk of physical and verbal abuse. Just stop it. The average domestic worker is only paid $12 per hour compared to the average wage of about $32 an hour. Despite this, domestic work is often hard and requires long hours. Domestic workers are also excluded from the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which means that they get little or no protection from the federal government. When you're a domestic worker, your boss is your family or the household you work for. This means that you have no one like HR to report problems to if something were to happen, and you have little power in your job since you're just often one person working for a family. In addition, domestic workers often don't fill out paperwork and are paid under the table, meaning there's no record of their work and they have no workers' rights guaranteed. These jobs lack access to insurance like most full-time jobs have, and they also aren't paid for off time. Some states have passed Domestic Workers' Rights Act, which provides some rights for workers, but this is only a few states, and this only counts if you fill out paperwork and are officially employed, which is not many people. These are just some of the struggles faced by domestic workers today. Some of the struggles faced today by domestic workers are very similar to those that people fought for during second wave feminism. For example, Pauletta Barnes, Diana Williams, and Michelle Vinson filed lawsuits against their bosses for sexual harassment, which influence laws today, which are similar to some laws that are being hoped to be passed for domestic workers. Also, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 rhymes with domestic workers' rights today. It made discrimination in workplace illegal under federal law, and this allowed more women to be offered and receive official jobs. Second wave feminism also raised awareness for domestic and sexual violence and harassment in the workspace. These are things that are still faced today by domestic workers. In addition, more specifically during second wave feminism, women were able to pass the Equal Pay Act of 1963. This act was supposed to get rid of the gender wage gap, but it is still a problem people face today. This was an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act. This helped many women receive equal pay in the workplace. However, women today still make only about 80% as much as men, which is about 83 cents to the white man's dollar. In addition, black women are paid even less, with around 60 cents for the white man's dollar. Domestic workers is an occupation dominated by women, and especially women of color. And this act fought for women in 1963, but it still seems to be a problem today, despite everything fought for during second wave feminism.
The smaller case study I'm going to be focusing on in 2022 is gender equality in sports. In the United States, women in professional sports, or even any sport around the country, have limited representation, resources, and overall injustices compared to men. This availability to have equal access to opportunities and more should be one of the main focuses of women's rights in the U.S. In the United States, women are not getting similar resources as men in sports. There is a very big pay gap between women and men professional athletes. The facilities between women and men are drastically different, as well as the media coverage of women's sports is at 4%. For example, in 2019, the U.S. women's national soccer team won the World Cup, but their pay compared to the U.S. men's national soccer team, which they didn't come close to winning, was completely different. In a scenario, if the U.S. women's national soccer team won all 20 games, they would make 89% of what the U.S. men's national soccer team would make if they won all 20 games. This issue of the pay gap and inequality in general in sports is directly related to the historical second wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism created the Equal Pay Act of 1963, though, as you can see, it directly falls short of its goal, and it is not enforced in many instances in sports. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 also created Title IX, which is another historical connection I'm going to talk about. Title IX gave women equal opportunities in sports and in the education system through funds from the government to institutions, but still in 2020, many institutions are not putting the funds from the government in regard to Title IX to use for women's sports and education, and we have to fix that. The biggest way to solve the injustices in women's rights is to advocate and acknowledge that this problem is happening. But beyond that, you can educate yourself by reading articles, watching videos, signing petitions, visiting organization websites, attending protests, and more.
Now how you can help.
For more information about our cause, visit mrstevensfavoritestudents.weebly.com. On our website, you can find everything we've said in this video.
Along with that, you can find links to videos, articles, places to donate, petitions, and organizations to support.
Thanks for watching!
We are a part of the WREOA, which is the Women's Rights Equal Opportunity Advocacy. I already messed up. Each of us has a specific... Each of us has a specific case. Do it really slowly.
The larger issue we are focused...
What's another word for severe?
Okay.
Fighting against domestic violence is incredibly important because it affects thousands of people each day. It can severely affect a person's life and cause severe physical, emotional.
I chose to focus on domestic workers' rights.
Why are you filming that?
91.5% of domestic women, or domestic.
Thousands of people each day. It can severely affect a person's life and cause severe physical, emotional damage and trauma to a person. No one should have to. No!